Hello and welcome to another GCSE revision video. This one focuses on paper 3 and looks at how the Nazis won power in the years 1929 to 1933. When we're looking at the growth of the Nazi Party, it helps to divide the period into three phases. Firstly, the early years, when Hitler took control of the party and began to shape it. Secondly, the lean years, when the Nazis tried but failed to achieve success. Finally, the years after 1929, when the Nazis finally won power. This is the part which we'll focus on in this video. Remember, there are also videos about the other two areas on our channel, so check out our Germany playlist for more helpful content. First, we're going to set some context by considering the situation in Germany by 1929. Let's start with the Nazi Party. They had some clear strengths by 1929. Hitler's skills and the publicity gained in his 1924 trial had helped to establish his reputation across Germany. His book Mein Kampf had shared a clear vision with the German people of what the Nazis actually stood for. The failure of the Munich Putsch had led to a change in Nazi tactics, so they were now focused on winning power in elections. The splits in the party had been resolved at the Bamberg Conference, and Hitler had reorganised the party so that it had a nationwide structure through which to campaign. The size of the SA had also been expanded. However, despite all this, the Nazis had very little success in elections by 1928, winning only a handful of seats in the Reichstag. Now let's turn to the Weimar Republic. In 1929, it looked reasonably stable. Stresemann's policies had improved Germany's position on the international stage. His economic policies had created a booming economy. Living standards were rising, particularly for workers. As a result of these improvements, moderate parties won more seats, while support for extreme parties dropped. Moderate parties worked together in more stable coalitions, and this meant the Republic was more politically stable than it had been in its early years. However, beneath the surface there were some problems. The economy was heavily dependent on US loans, which could be withdrawn at any time. Stresemann described this as dancing on a volcano. And even though some groups did well, others were left out. Farmers in particular did not benefit much from the economic growth. So in summary, by 1929, the Nazis had not really made a breakthrough, and German democracy looked more stable. Now look at what happened after 1929. Here you can see the number of seats in the Reichstag won by the Nazis in elections during the early 1930s. As you can see, there was a dramatic increase. Nazi support grew particularly rapidly in this period. We're going to look at why. It helps to divide the reasons for Nazi success into two groups. Firstly, events which were outside the Nazis' direct control, but which helped them to gain support. And secondly, strengths of the Nazis themselves. Let's look at the events first. First up, the Wall Street crash and the Great Depression. This was a worldwide economic slump which began in the USA when the American stock market crashed in October 1929. Shares lost their value almost overnight, which resulted in American banks and businesses losing their investments quickly. This American economic crash spread to Germany. Here's how. When the American economy got into difficulty, the USA withdrew its Dawes Plan loans. Now remember, German industry and business were reliant on these loans. So when the money was withdrawn, German banks and businesses began going bankrupt. When they went bankrupt, they made their workers unemployed. Unemployed workers had less disposable income, so they spent less in the shops. As sales slowed down, businesses made less profit. This then became a vicious circle. As profits dropped, more businesses went bust, and the cycle continued to get worse. So, how did the Great Depression affect Germany? Let's think about the economic and social impact first. German banks and businesses went bankrupt, so unemployment rose quickly, hitting 6.1 million by 1933. Farmers struggled badly too, falling into debt. Social problems increased, particularly homelessness, poverty and hunger. Crime and violence also went up, with groups of angry, unemployed young men fighting in the streets. Meanwhile, the government found its finances were stretched. More unemployment meant less workers were paying taxes, while the government was having to pay out more in unemployment benefit. These economic and social effects had a political impact too. Chancellor Brüning was unable to deal with the economic crisis. He was cautious about the danger of another hyperinflation, so he refused to print money. Instead, he cut wages, cut benefits, and raised taxes. These were all measures designed to balance the government's budget, but to Germans who were already struggling, they looked heartless and they made life harder. So Brüning was nicknamed the Hunger Chancellor. Brüning's policies were not popular with his coalition partners either. The Social Democrats refused to go along with his strategy, so the coalition broke down. This meant Brüning had to fall back on Article 48, asking President Hindenburg to pass his laws by decree. This happened more and more, 66 times in 1932 alone. Meanwhile, the Reichstag met less and less frequently. To the German public, this looked like proof that democracy was no good in a crisis, and that only a strong government could deal with such an emergency. Support drained away from the moderate parties, and extreme parties began winning more votes. The process went something like this. Suffering workers turned to the Communist Party for help. As communists won more votes, wealthy and middle-class Germans were alarmed, fearing a communist takeover. They reacted by voting Nazi, the only party which looked strong enough to deal with the communist threat. So here you can see a summary of how events helped the Nazis to gain support. You might like to pause the video here and talk yourself through the events out loud to rehearse your own explanations. Now let's look at the Nazis' own strengths. Firstly, Hitler himself, who possessed exceptional speaking skills and projected himself as a strong leader. This gave people hope in a time when they felt despair. As democracy looked weak in the face of economic crisis, Hitler's image of strength looked particularly attractive to voters. The SA were also important. They paraded in uniforms, organised help for the homeless, and battled the opposition parties, particularly the communists. In a time of chaos, such as the Great Depression, the SA gave the Nazis a reputation for strength, discipline, and order, which was attractive to many voters. They also looked like the only party tough enough to deal with the communist threat. Nazi policies and promises also played a role. They offered a huge variety and were also very flexible, dropping policies which were unpopular with voters. Frequently, their policies were vague but inspiring promises to make Germany great again. The point here is that the Nazis offered something for everybody. Different promises were tailored to attract different groups, so the Nazis picked up support from all social classes. Nazi campaigns and propaganda were very effective. Hitler's reorganisation during the lean years meant that the party had a nationwide structure of local branches, who leafleted and knocked on doors to persuade voters. Rallies, parades, and posters projected an image of strength. All this was paid for by generous industrialists who were themselves fearful of the communist threat. The campaigns mattered because they reinforced the idea that the party was organised, capable, and efficient. Voters were carefully targeted with policies that appealed to them specifically, and Nazi propaganda stirred up existing fears of a communist takeover. These were particularly effective at persuading the middle classes to vote Nazi. Finally, the Nazis embraced technology, specifically aeroplanes and radio, which were new forms of campaigning technology in the 1930s. Such methods enabled Hitler to reach a wide audience and made the Nazis look like a dynamic, modern party. It's likely that this is what attracted so many young people to vote for the party. So here are the main factors which led to increased Nazi support. Before we go any further, try pausing the video and talk yourself through the factors out loud. Spend a minute or so explaining each one. Then think about these two questions. Firstly, what links can you see between these different factors? And secondly, which do you think was more important, the Nazis' own strengths or other events outside the Nazis' control? Now, not all groups in German society were equally important to the Nazis' success. Let's look at which groups were more and less important. It's wrong to make big generalisations about whole social classes, but there are some broad trends which we can be fairly sure about. The Nazis certainly tried to appeal to the workers who were suffering during the Depression. They were attracted to the Nazis' promises to help them in this economic crisis. However, although workers did vote Nazi, many more continued to vote for the Communist Party. At first, women were not a big source of support for the Nazis. Some of them were put off by the Nazis' emphasis on conservative values and traditional ideas about the role of women. However, as the economic crisis dragged on, women became increasingly likely to vote Nazi because the Nazis promised help for their husbands and for their families during the Depression. The middle class were a big source of support for the Nazis. They had lost their savings and investments during the Depression, and they saw Hitler as a strong leader who could help the country to recover. They also feared the Communist Party and its ideas about redistributing wealth. Some of the middle classes also felt that morals had gone downhill during the Weimar period, and they liked the Nazis' emphasis on traditional values. Finally, farmers were a key group in the Nazis' success. Many of them had fallen into debt during the Depression, and once the Nazis dropped their policy of confiscating land, farmers were more willing to support them. They voted Nazi in large numbers. In fact, in some rural areas, the Nazis gained up to 60% of the votes. So the events and factors we've been looking at help to explain why the Nazis won 230 seats in the July 1932 election. However, they don't fully explain why Hitler was appointed Chancellor in January 1933. Here there is a further factor in play, a political rivalry which helped Hitler into power. Here's what happened. After the July election, Hindenburg appointed his friend von Papen of the Centre Party as Chancellor. There was a further election in November. here the Nazis did less well, dropping 34 seats. Now this is important because it suggests that Nazi support had gone past its peak. Perhaps Nazi support might have continued to drop. However, at this point, in December 1932, von Schleicher, a landowner and an ex-army general, he betrayed von Papen and he persuaded Hindenburg to make him Chancellor instead. Now, von Papen was determined to win back power. In order to do so, he decided to use the Nazis. He struck a deal with Hitler. He would support Hitler's demand to be Chancellor in return for being made Vice-Chancellor. Now, Hindenburg disliked Hitler, but von Papen persuaded him to agree to the plan. Firstly, by warning him that von Schleicher was planning an armed takeover. Secondly, he convinced Hindenburg that Hitler could be controlled if they limited the number of Nazis in the cabinet to a total of 3. Together, von Papen assured Hindenburg that they would squeeze Hitler into a corner so he would squeak like a mouse. Hindenburg agreed, and he appointed Hitler as Chancellor in January 1933. Far from being under control, Hitler was very quickly out of control, and you can revise that in one of the other videos on our channel. If you're keen to follow up on this further, here's an interpretation question which you could have a go at, based on 2 different historians' views of Hitler's rise to power. If you would like to take this even further, here's a question you could have a go at using your notes from this video. Thanks for watching. If the tutorial was useful, don't forget to like the video. There are videos covering the rest of the Germany content on our YouTube channel, as well as Paper 3 exam technique. And remember, hit that subscribe button to become one of our followers.